The door didn't open. It detonated. One kick, then another, and the motel room exploded into light as flood lamps smashed the darkness. "Federal agents! Hands where we can see them!" Boots hammered cheap carpet. Wood splintered. A shotgun racked like a verdict. In the hallway, a Browning automatic rifle sat on a shoulder, breathing smoke before it even fired. Inside, the air stank of gasoline, sweat, and old gun oil. They found the Ford V8 first, backed crooked under the awning, engine still warm, license plates stacked like playing cards, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Louisiana. On the passenger seat, a road atlas stabbed with pins, red thread crossing counties like veins. In the trunk, the haul was obscene. 3 automatic rifles, 2 sawed-off shotguns, 12 pistols, and boxes of .30-06 and .45 ammunition counted out loud. 1,472 rounds. A canvas sack, coughed up cash, $3,286 in mixed bills, stained with dirt and panic. Then she appeared, Bonnie Parker, small frame, hair pinned tight, cigarette glowing steady between 2 fingers as if the raid were theater. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. Her eyes moved over the muzzles aimed at her like she was measuring them. A marshal snapped cuffs on her wrists. She tilted her chin, calm as stone, lips forming the faintest smile. On the bed lay the file they'd built to kill her with, nationwide warrants, photographs of dead officers, and a typed summary stamped in red: murder, armed robbery, escape, recommended sentence, life, no parole. When the agent read it, Bonnie only exhaled smoke and whispered, almost amused, "Is that all?" A camera flash popped, evidence for tomorrow's headlines. On the nightstand, a lipstick tube beside a box of stolen diamonds, 214 tiny stones rattling like teeth. Under the mattress, handwritten verses in blue ink, a poem titled The End. Outside, sirens layered over breathing of men who knew this would be argued in court. The question hung in muzzle smoke. How does a girl become a legend? Before the gunfire and the headlines, there was a girl in West Dallas, with dust on her shoes and ink on her fingers. Bonnie Parker learned early that beauty could be borrowed, but hunger was permanent. The Great Depression pressed its thumb on every doorstep. Rent overdue, cupboards thin, hope thinner. She was sharp, restless, the kind of child who listened too closely to adult whispers. At school, she wrote clean lines and secret poems, folding them small enough to hide in her pocket. Her mother's hands were always busy, always tired. Bonnie watched pennies become supper, watched neighbors trade dignity for credit. She wanted a stage, a ticket out, anything that proved she was more than a name on a ration list. At 16, she married too young, chasing stability like a mirage. It cracked almost immediately, leaving her alone in a city that didn't care. She worked as a waitress, smiling through aching feet, memorizing faces that treated her like furniture. Nights were quieter. She'd sit by a window, notebook open, writing about roads, freedom, and endings she couldn't yet imagine. Some poems were prayers, others warnings, all of them hungry. Then, one afternoon in 1930, in a friend's house that smelled of heat and cheap soap, she saw him, Clyde Barrow, leaning in a doorway like trouble had learned to grin. His eyes carried the same hard question as hers. What do you do when the world says you deserve nothing? No mercy. Not. and she felt the road open beneath her, dark and wide. Clyde Barrow wasn't born a legend. He was carved by empty stomachs and locked doors. He grew up on the edge of Dallas, where boys learned faster from the street than from school. The Depression didn't just steal money, it stole futures. Clyde stole back in small ways at first: cars, chickens, anything that could be traded for survival, until survival turned into habit. Then prison happened, and prison rewired him. Behind bars, cruelty became routine, and Clyde learned a single truth: the law didn't punish men, it broke them. He walked out with hatred packed tighter than his belongings and a vow that he'd never be helpless again. Bonnie watched that rage like someone watching lightning too close. She could feel the danger, yet it spoke to the part of her that was tired of being invisible. When Clyde pressed a pistol into her palm for the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like a key. He didn't call it crime. He called it escape. The first job was small, almost pathetic. A stolen Ford, a quick hit on a rural store, a dash before anyone understood what happened. But chaos has its own gravity. A clerk reached under the counter, eyes wide, and Clyde fired without hesitation. The shot cracked the room in half. Bonnie froze for a heartbeat, then grabbed the cash bag with shaking hands and ran. Outside, tires screamed, gravel spit, and the night swallowed them whole. They crossed county lines like cutting ropes. Somewhere behind them, a man bled on a dirty floor, and the world had shifted. Bonnie didn't speak. She stared out the window at the black highway, poetry still in her pocket, now stained with the first spark of something she could never undo. The Ford V8 became their religion, not a car, a moving shadow with an engine strong enough to outrun consequence. Clyde didn't just drive it, he listened to it, felt every vibration through the wheel like it was a pulse shared between man and machine. He learned the back roads the way preachers learned scripture: farm lanes, bridge crossings, county cuts that never appeared on tourist maps. Each stolen vehicle was temporary, but the V8 was different, fast, reliable, built for flight. It turned distance into armor. They built a system around speed: small targets, quick entry, quicker exit, rural stores that kept cash in tins, gas stations where the clerk worked alone, banks so small they couldn't afford guards, just faith. Clyde would coast in like a customer, Bonnie close behind with her face calm and her hands hidden. 10 seconds to control the room, 20 to empty the drawer, 30 to vanish. The longer you stayed, the more the world could recognize you, and the engine always answered. Tires burned on gravel, then bit into open highway. County lines passed like torn paper. One town became another, one state another, until borders meant nothing. They slept in ditches, behind abandoned barns, in cheap cabins that smelled of mildew and fear. By dawn, they were ghosts again, leaving only dust, spent casings, and stunned silence. In those early months, the law still chased yesterday's footprints. Sheriffs acted alone. Radios were slow. Coordination was clumsy. Clyde exploited every second of delay. The Ford V8 didn't just carry them, it erased them. Each mile widened the distance between who Bonnie had been and what she was becoming. A woman riding shotgun toward a life with no reverse gear. Blood didn't arrive like thunder. It arrived like a mistake that refused to stay small. On a humid afternoon outside a forgotten town, they hit a grocery that kept its money in a tin under the counter. Bonnie stood by the door, face blank, eyes tracking the room. Clyde leaned in, voice low, pistol angled just enough to be understood. The clerk nodded too fast, hands trembling. Then a sound, the metallic click of something being pulled from beneath the drawer. The clerk's eyes changed, fear hardening into decision. Clyde's head snapped. Time narrowed to one breath. "Don't," Bonnie whispered, but panic swallowed it. Clyde fired once. The shot split the counter and drove the clerk backward into shelves of canned goods. Glass shattered. The tin clattered to the floor, spilling coins that rolled like tiny alarms. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Bonnie felt the room tilt as if gravity had shifted. The clerk tried to breathe. A wet sound came out instead. Clyde stared, jaw tight, eyes empty, already beyond regret. Bonnie's hand shook as she scooped cash into the sack. She couldn't look at the blood pooling on the linoleum. They ran. Tires screamed. The Ford lunged onto the road, leaving the store behind like a bad dream. Bonnie stared through the windshield, waiting for tears that didn't come. Clyde lit a cigarette with steady hands. After first blood, the world didn't end. It kept turning. And in normality, Bonnie understood the rule. Once you cross, you never truly return yet now. The first posters were crude. Black ink, stiff faces, a reward figure that looked like a joke. Most people barely glanced. In the Depression, everyone was running from something, debt, hunger, the slow humiliation of poverty. Outlaws were not rare, just louder. But Bonnie and Clyde were different. They moved like a rumor that couldn't be pinned down. By the time one sheriff tacked their faces to a saloon wall, they were already 2 counties away, laughing over cold coffee and stolen bread. Newspapers did the rest. Headlines sharpened their names into weapons. Barrow gang strikes again. Photographs were described with the heat of scandal. Bonnie's lipstick, Clyde's grin, the Ford V8, like a black stallion beneath them. Some editors framed them as monsters. Others framed them as lovers who robbed the powerful and outran fate. People chose the version they needed. A hungry farmer reading by lamplight might whisper, "At least somebody's winning." A widow might spit on the page. In towns they passed through, stories inflated like balloons. A clerk swore Clyde carried a machine gun. A bartender claimed Bonnie shot first. A preacher insisted they were demons sent to punish sin. Nobody agreed on truth, but everyone agreed on spectacle. Their names became a fever. The law hated that most of all, not the theft, not even the killings, but the myth, because myths recruit sympathy, and sympathy hides fugitives. Every new poster carried a larger reward and a colder warning. Yet the faces on the paper began to look less like criminals and more like icons. 2 young ghosts the nation couldn't stop chasing or watching or secretly wishing could escape. In Joplin, Missouri, they rented a small garage apartment like ordinary drifters. 2 couples too young to look dangerous, too quiet to draw attention. Curtains stayed drawn. The engine cooled only long enough to be warmed again. They cooked cheap meals, washed shirts in a basin, and laughed just loud enough to sound normal. But normal has cracks, and Joplin was a town that listened. The neighbor next door was a woman who counted details the way poor people counted money. Strange men carried bundles inside at night. Cars arrived and left at odd hours. There was no steady work, yet groceries appeared. Once she saw a rifle barrel wrapped in cloth. Another time she heard a metallic clink like magazines being loaded. She didn't know their names, but she knew trouble. In 1933, trouble meant one thing, either bootleggers or killers. She told someone. That someone told the police. 2 local officers came by first, thinking it was routine, a quick bust, an easy headline. They brought shotguns, badges, and confidence. More officers arrived, crowding the alley behind the building. It was a soft knock, then a louder one. "Open up! Police!" Inside, Clyde's eyes narrowed. Bonnie didn't scream. She listened. The silence before violence was familiar now. The door cracked, and in that sliver of space Clyde saw the badge, the shotgun, the certainty that the law would take him back to cages. He didn't hesitate. The first shots ripped through cheap wood and thin walls. Glass burst. Officers shouted, staggered, fell. The alley turned into a slaughterhouse of echoes. Bonnie crawled low, grabbing ammunition, breath tight in her throat. Bullets punched holes into plaster like fists. Then the engine roared. Ford V8 alive, hungry, ready. They crashed out of the garage like a storm breaking free. Tires screamed. Smoke swallowed the alley. Behind them, Joplin learned the truth too late. The informant had knocked on the wrong door, and the law had stepped straight into hell. They escaped Joplin with blood still warm on the air, but they left something behind that was deadlier than any bullet. When the police finally pushed into the wrecked garage apartment, they expected liquor, guns, maybe stolen cash. They found those. Rifles stacked against the wall, pistols on a table, ammunition in open boxes like spilled grain. But the real bomb sat quiet in a paper sack, rolls of undeveloped film. An officer held the canisters up like harmless toys. He didn't understand that inside those black tubes was a national fever waiting to be born. The film was rushed to a lab, developed with shaking hands, and the pictures that emerged hit the country like a slap. Bonnie Parker, tiny, fearless, posing with a cigar clenched between her teeth, 1 foot on the bumper of a stolen car like she owned the world. Bonnie smiling with a pistol in her hand, eyes bright, almost playful. Clyde beside her, relaxed, gun cradled like a lover. They weren't hiding. They were performing. The photographs didn't just document crime. They glamorized it, weaponized it, turned fugitives into cinema before cinema could catch up. Newspapers swallowed the images and spat them across America. Within days, their faces were pinned in post offices, barber shops, diner walls. The myth gained a body. In living rooms, poor families stared at the photos with conflicted hunger, fear mixed with fascination, hate mixed with envy. The law saw the same pictures and felt something colder than outrage, humiliation, because those photos proved a terrifying truth. Bonnie and Clyde weren't merely running. They were rewriting the chase into a story, and the nation couldn't stop reading. After Joplin, the hunt stopped being local. It became organized, armored, and ruthless. The deaths of officers were no longer incidents. They were proof of a traveling war. Sheriffs who once guarded only their own county lines now talked over telephones late at night. voices low, anger sharp. States that used to distrust each other began trading information like ammunition. Patterns formed on maps. The Barrow gang favored small towns with weak banks, roads that led to open country, and hideouts with quick exits. They crossed borders like borders were lies. Investigators marked every reported sighting, every stolen Ford, every .45 casing recovered from a crime scene. The lines began to connect into a moving shape, an invisible beast roaming the South. The task force learned to think like Clyde. He liked roads near rivers where bridges offered choke points. He avoided large cities unless he needed supplies. He returned to familiar territory in Texas like a wolf circling its old den. They studied his habits, what he ate, what he drank, which mechanics he trusted, which doctors would stitch a wound without questions. Even a cigarette brand became a clue. They built informant networks from desperation. Gas station clerks were offered cash for a phone call. Waitresses were told to note scars, accents, nervous hands. Farmers were warned to watch for strangers sleeping in barns. A few men, hungry for reward money, followed rumors like dogs. Others gave tips out of fear. The hunt became a net woven from gossip and surveillance. And for the first time, lawmen began to speak one sentence without romance, without mercy. They would not bring them in gently. They would bring them in dead, if needed. The investigation line was no longer chasing criminals. It was preparing to erase a legend. The law learned fast, because the dead taught them how. Lone sheriffs with badges and shotguns were replaced by quiet men in plain coats who didn't talk much and never blinked. They stopped chasing smoke and started chasing habits. Every cheap room rented under a false name was logged. Every stolen Ford was traced. Every phone call made from a rural switchboard was watched like a wire stretched tight. They leaned into surveillance the way hunters lean into wind. Operators at small-town exchanges were pressured, bribed, or frightened into listening. Names, numbers, fragments of conversation copied onto paper. If a call mentioned a mechanic, the mechanic was visited. If a call mentioned a cousin, the cousin's mailbox was checked. Even silence became data. A sudden stop in communication meant movement. Movement meant roads. Roads meant ambush points. Tail cars became ghosts. Unmarked sedans followed at a distance, swapping drivers at county lines so the same face wouldn't be noticed twice. They learned to hide in mirrors, to drift back when the Ford V8 sped up, to close in when it slowed near fuel. Shadow teams planted themselves near diners, feed stores, roadside cabins, anywhere fugitives might show their hunger. Men waited in ditches for hours with rifles wrapped in cloth, breathing through dust. The net tightened in small, invisible bites. A waitress in Arkansas was given a code phrase to use if Bonnie appeared. A gas attendant in Louisiana was taught how to signal with a rag on a pump handle. A farm boy was promised reward money if he remembered tire treads. In the dark, lawmen moved like quiet wolves, not searching for the myth, searching for the human weakness inside it. And every mile Bonnie and Clyde traveled, they didn't just outrun police anymore. They outran an intelligence machine that was learning their heartbeat. The first close call came on a 2-lane road lined with pine and silence. Clyde saw it too late. A deputy's car parked at an angle, a man stepping out with a rifle, Another figure hidden behind a tree. The trap wasn't loud. It was patient. Clyde's foot slammed the accelerator, and the Ford V8 surged forward like an animal escaping a snare. Shots cracked, glass spiderwebbed. A bullet kissed the metal door and screamed away into the woods. Bonnie didn't scream. She ducked low, pulled a pistol from beneath her coat, and fired through the shattered window. The recoil bruised her wrist. The deputy stumbled back. Clyde jerked the wheel hard, tires fishtailing across loose gravel as the car slashed through a ditch and climbed back onto the road in a spray of dirt. They disappeared into green darkness, engine howling, hearts hammering like drums. The second escape was uglier, close enough to smell the gunpowder on the wind. They'd stopped for fuel at dusk, thinking the station was empty. It wasn't. An unmarked sedan rolled in, slow, too smooth, too deliberate. Clyde's eyes narrowed. The driver didn't get out. He just watched. That was enough. Clyde grabbed the shotgun from the floorboard and stepped toward the sedan. The window dropped a few inches, just enough for a muzzle to appear. They fired almost simultaneously. The station sign exploded. A pump burst, spraying gasoline like blood. Bonnie dragged the attendant away from the flames, then threw herself back into the Ford as Clyde gunned it. A pursuing car appeared behind them, headlights cutting the night like knives. The chase tore through backroads at suicidal speed. Tires screamed around blind turns. The Ford clipped a fence, ripped through a field, and burst onto another road just as the pursuers lost them in dust. When it ended, Clyde was laughing, thin, shaky, half mad. Bonnie stared at her trembling hands and understood the new reality. Every stop, every breath could be the last. The Barrow gang couldn't stay two people forever. The road demanded more hands. Someone to watch the rear, someone to load magazines, someone to run inside while Bonnie stayed close to the escape line. Each month, the net tightened, and Clyde understood a hard truth. Speed alone wasn't enough anymore. They needed numbers, bodies willing to bleed. Recruits came from the same place Clyde came from, poverty with a gun-shaped hunger, teen boys with hollow eyes, men with bruised pride, drifters who wanted a story bigger than their names. Clyde tested them fast. If they hesitated at a drawn pistol, they were out. If they talked too much, they were out. Loyalty wasn't asked for, it was demanded like air. The gang evolved into a moving unit. One car became two when possible. They rotated drivers. They scouted towns before hitting them, circling like wolves. Bonnie learned to read faces, who might run for help, who might reach for a hidden weapon, who might freeze. Clyde became colder, more tactical, the violence more intentional. They stopped improvising and started planning. Safe routes, backup roads, prearranged meeting points in case of separation. But growth brought noise. More mouths meant more mistakes. A new member left cigarette butts behind. Another bragged in a bar, drunk on his own myth. Every addition created a new thread the law could grab. The gang began to carry heavier weapons, more rifles, more ammunition, turning robberies into small wars. Where Bonnie and Clyde once moved like shadows, the larger crew moved like a storm. And in that storm, something changed. The crimes weren't just about money anymore. They were about survival against a nation that wanted them erased. The gang evolved, stronger, louder, deadlier, yet every step forward also carved a clearer trail for the hunters behind them. Eastham wasn't just a place on a map. It was a scar inside Clyde Barrow's skull, a memory that never stopped bleeding. Nights on the road, when the engine cooled and Bonnie slept with a pistol under her hand, Clyde would sit awake and stare into darkness as if the darkness were bars. He rarely spoke of prison, but when he did, his voice changed. Flat, poisonous, stripped of every soft edge. He talked about the prison farm like it was a slaughterhouse dressed up as justice. Men worked until their backs split, guards laughed, and pain became routine as breakfast. He had gone in a thief and come out something else. Eastham taught him that the law didn't correct men. It broke them, then buried the pieces. He carried the humiliation like a second spine. The beatings, the forced labor, the helplessness that burned hotter than hunger. Somewhere in that place, Clyde made a promise to himself. Never again. Never caged. Never owned. So, when the gang's crimes escalated and the manhunt tightened, Clyde's mind circled back to Eastham with obsessive clarity, not as a risk, but as a mission. He wanted to rip open the prison's throat and drag his people out. Some of his old friends were still there, men who had taken lashes for nothing, men who had watched time rot their youth. To Clyde, they weren't inmates. They were soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. Bonnie saw it in him. The way his hands clenched when Eastham was mentioned, the way his eyes turned cold like steel left in winter. This wasn't robbery anymore. This was revenge-wearing strategy. Clyde began studying schedules, guard patterns, road access, the rhythm of shift changes. He drew crude diagrams in dirt, then erased them with his boot. He collected weapons quietly, building an arsenal with one purpose. Eastham wasn't a dream. It was a target. And Clyde was done running from the past. He was going to shoot it in the face. January 16th, 1934, morning at Eastham Prison Farm looked ordinary from a distance. Fields soaked in pale sun, men in striped fatigue swinging tools like machines. But Clyde had already turned the day into a trap. The gang arrived quiet. Cars hidden off-road beneath trees, weapons wrapped in sacks like stolen grain. They watched the work detail march out, counted guards, noted angles, waited for the exact moment. Discipline relaxed. Then the farm erupted. A shotgun blast punched the air first, sharp and final. Guards spun, shouting, reaching for rifles, too slow. Clyde stepped from cover with a bar raised like judgment, and the sound that followed wasn't gunfire. It was machinery chewing through authority. Dirt kicked up, a tower window shattered, men dropped, inmates froze, then surged forward as if the earth itself had opened. Bonnie moved low, handing magazines, scanning the perimeter with a pistol ready. Clyde shouted names, men he remembered, men he'd promised. The escapees ran toward the tree line where a car waited with doors open. One guard tried to rally, screaming orders, firing blindly. Clyde answered with a burst that slammed him backward into the mud. The breakout lasted minutes, but it felt like a revolution. Chains didn't just break, they were ripped apart. By the time sirens began to wail in the distance, the gang was already moving. Tires shredding gravel, engines roaring, dust rising like smoke from a battlefield. Behind them, Eastham was chaos. Bodies on the ground, rifles abandoned, supervisors shouting into radios that couldn't bring back control. For Clyde, it wasn't simply an escape plan. It was a message carved in bullets. The prison that had owned him could be violated, humiliated, exposed. And as the Ford V8 vanished into open road, Bonnie looked at Clyde's face, hard, glowing with vengeance, and understood the worst part. After Eastham, there would be no turning down the heat, only war. After Eastham, the country stopped pretending this was romantic outlaw crime. It was terrorism on wheels. The prison farm breakout didn't just free inmates. It humiliated the state, killed authority in broad daylight, and proved that Bonnie and Clyde could strike government property like a military unit. Newspapers screamed the story across breakfast tables, and the names Barrow Gang became a warning parents whispered to children at night. Texas officials demanded blood. Governors called meetings. Rangers who had once chased cattle thieves were now given rifles and permission to end the chase without hesitation. The Bureau's attention sharpened, files thickened, photographs multiplied. Telegraph lines carried descriptions faster than cars could run. Wanted posters changed tone from reward to kill order. The law began to coordinate like an army, not a collection of counties. Highways became hunting grounds. Patrol units were stationed at bridge crossings. Gas stations were monitored. Roadside cabins were watched through binoculars from ditches. Mechanics were questioned until they shook. Doctors were threatened with jail if they treated wounded strangers. A moving net was built from fear, money, and politics. And the manhunt gained something worse than organization. It gained obsession. Officers studied Clyde's psychology the way gamblers studied dice. They mapped his likely routes, predicted his returns to Texas, tracked his family connections. Surveillance teams sat for hours near relatives' homes, waiting for a shadow to appear. Informants were planted among friends, cousins, lovers, anyone who might crack under pressure. Bonnie felt it first in the air. Towns looked at them differently. Doors closed faster. Eyes avoided their faces. Even when they succeeded, the victories felt smaller, meaner. Clyde kept smiling, but his sleep broke into pieces. Because now the chase had changed. It wasn't catch them. It was end them. The nation wanted a corpse to put on the table, proof that the law still ruled the road. And Bonnie and Clyde, once fast enough to disappear, were now running inside a spotlight that followed everywhere. It started like an ordinary stop, the kind that should have ended with a warning and dust. A quiet stretch near Grapevine, Texas. Late afternoon light sinking low, the road empty enough to feel safe. Clyde drove with one hand on the wheel, scanning mirrors out of habit. Bonnie sat close, coat collar up, eyes half-lidded, but alert. They were tired. Tired people make mistakes. 2 motorcycles appeared behind them, gaining fast. Officers in crisp uniforms, badges flashing in sunlight. The signal was clear. Pull over. Clyde's jaw tightened. He slowed, letting the Ford drift to the shoulder, engine still breathing like a restrained animal. One officer dismounted, hand hovering near his holster, posture confident. He thought this was routine. Then everything snapped. Clyde saw the hesitation in the officer's step, the way his eyes dropped to the car's interior, recognizing something wrong. Too many shadows, too much tension. The officer raised his arm, not to wave, but to draw. Clyde's hand moved first. The pistol came up from beneath his thigh and fired through open air like a decision. The officer folded, collapsing hard onto gravel. The second officer shouted, scrambling behind his motorcycle, firing wildly. Bullets slapped the Ford's frame. Glass burst. Bonnie ducked, then rose with a weapon in both hands, face pale but controlled. She fired short, sharp shots. No scream, no mercy, only survival. The second officer staggered, dropped to one knee, then fell sideways as the road drank his blood. The entire stop lasted seconds. No exchange of words, no arrest, no chance. It was execution, born from panic and speed. Clyde slammed the accelerator, and the Ford tore forward, leaving two bodies on asphalt like proof that the chase had turned absolute. As the wind roared through broken glass, Bonnie stared ahead, breathing shallow. Somewhere deep inside she understood. The law would never forgive this, and neither would the country that read the headlines tomorrow. The news hit like a punch to the throat. 2 young officers dead on a Texas road. No bank vault, no gunfight at a hideout, no they had it coming excuse. Just a traffic stop that ended in blood. By the time the story reached radios and paperboys, it had already grown teeth. Headlines didn't call them lovers anymore. They called them butchers. Mothers read the details and tightened their grip on their children's hands. Deputies read it and felt their stomachs turn to stone. Whatever sympathy had once existed, whatever cheap romance the Depression had painted over their crimes, evaporated overnight. The country had tolerated robbery because it felt distant. It couldn't tolerate execution because it felt personal. Every officer became a brother, a son, a man in uniform who could be ambushed for simply doing his job. The myth began to rot. In diners, people stopped joking about Bonnie's lipstick and Clyde's grin. Conversations turned bitter. "They'll kill anybody," someone would say, and others would nod with the grim unity of fear. In church, preachers spoke their names with disgust, as if saying them out loud invited evil. Even the poor, once tempted to admire them, began to whisper a different truth. Hunger didn't excuse murder. For lawmen, the shift was immediate. The chase was no longer about capture. It was about extermination. Politicians demanded action. Rangers demanded authority. The public wanted closure, a visible end, a certainty that the highways could be safe again. Rewards climbed. Posters changed language. The message hardened into one sentence. There would be no negotiation. Bonnie felt it in the way doors shut quicker, in the stares that lasted too long, in the sudden absence of helpful strangers. The air itself seemed hostile now, thick with accusation. They were no longer running through a country distracted by hardship. They were running through a country that hated them, united, watching, waiting for the moment the legend turned into a corpse. They stopped calling it a chase and started calling it an operation. After the roadside killings, the task force was rebuilt with men who didn't flinch at rumors and didn't care about legends. Experienced trackers, Texas Rangers, sheriffs with dead friends, faces carved by dust and failure. In meetings held behind closed doors, names were spoken like weapons. The law needed hunters with reputations sharp enough to scare criminals in their sleep. A lead investigator emerged from the noise, quiet, methodical, brutal when necessary. He didn't brag. He didn't smile for reporters. He studied Clyde the way surgeons studied disease. He read the reports line by line, not for drama, but for pattern, timing, routes, food stops, the rhythm of their movement. He circled counties on maps, drew arrows, predicted where they would be before they knew themselves. They're not supernatural, he told the room. They're predictable. They eat. They bleed. They need people. The investigation shifted into psychological warfare. Surveillance teams camped near family homes. Informants were offered cash, threatened with prison, squeezed until fear became cooperation. Telephone operators were leaned on again. Anyone who sold tires, ammo, or canned food in the right corridor was questioned. A new rule spread across departments. No heroics, no solo arrests, no mistakes. Bonnie and Clyde were to be handled like armed fugitives in wartime. Even the language changed. Suspects became targets. Capture became stop. They prepared ambush drills, rehearsed vehicle containment, practiced firing lines. The plan was no longer to corner them in a room. It was to end them on open road where escape couldn't happen. Bonnie and Clyde felt the shift without seeing it. The pressure wasn't just behind them anymore, it was ahead, like the future had been seeded with lawmen. Every mile forward, they weren't racing toward freedom. They were racing toward an investigator who finally had what the others lacked: patience, and a name that would be remembered as the man who ended the myth. The task force stopped hunting the car and started hunting the people. They knew Clyde could steal another Ford, steal another gun, steal another mile, but he couldn't steal loyalty forever. Everyone breaks somewhere: hunger, fear, jealousy, a girlfriend left crying in a kitchen. So they built pressure like a slow tightening wire around the gang's weakest link. They didn't kick doors at first. They waited outside cafes, watched who bought cigarettes for whom, who mailed letters, who slipped into family houses after dark. When they found the right thread, they pulled gently. A cousin was arrested on a minor charge and offered release for a name. A mechanic was threatened with prison if he kept quiet. A young gang member's mother was visited by two men in plain coats who spoke softly about coffins and regret. Then came the offer: cash, immunity, a clean life, if someone talked, and someone did. Not a confession, not a dramatic betrayal, just small crumbs. Which road they liked at night, which diner they trusted, which farmhouse had a hidden shed. The investigator collected each detail like fingerprints, assembling a living map. Inside the gang, paranoia spread. Clyde watched his own men too long. Bonnie heard whispers when engines cooled. Trust became a luxury they could no longer afford. The weak link wasn't just one person. It was the fear growing between them, turning allies into liabilities, turning the road into a trap. Every secret sold brought the law one step closer. Now the crumbs became coordinates. Once the weak link gave the task force a corridor, certain roads, certain hours, the hunt turned mechanical. They stopped reacting and started placing the future. Highway surveillance expanded like a military grid. Spotters hid near bridges with binoculars and notebooks. Patrol cars idled behind billboards. Rangers lay flat in ditches, faces pressed into dirt, waiting for the sound of an engine that meant history. Trap planning was brutal in its simplicity. They studied choke points, narrow bends where speed died, wooden bridges that forced cars into a straight line, Stretches of road bordered by swamp or thick timber where turning off meant drowning or crashing. They marked locations where a Ford V8 would be forced to slow, where a surprise vehicle could block the lane, where firing angles would be clean and crossfire controlled. Teams rehearsed silently. One unit would sit a mile ahead to confirm sighting. Another would follow at distance, never engaging, just guiding the target into the kill zone. A third would wait at the ambush point. Rifles rested on car hoods, engines off, men breathing through teeth. They practiced the first 10 seconds again and again. Shout, no. Warning, no. The plan required only one thing: finality. In small towns, everyone became an unwitting censor. Gas attendants were told to report stolen plates. Waitresses were trained to notice scars and limps. Farmers were promised reward money if a certain Ford appeared on a back road. The entire region became a listening machine. Bonnie felt the world turning hostile. Roads seemed too empty, silence too deliberate. Clyde drove harder, eyes never leaving mirrors, hands tight on the wheel. But surveillance doesn't need speed. It needs patience. And now the law had enough of it to turn highways into cages without bars. Gunfights stopped feeling like emergencies and started feeling like weather. Sudden, violent, expected. The gang no longer argued about whether to shoot. They argued about when. Every town edge, every lonely crossroads, every gas pump under a dead bulb could become a battlefield. They lived with weapons already in hand, fingers trained to move faster than thought. Clyde kept the shotgun across his lap. Bonnie kept a pistol tucked where her heartbeat couldn't shake it loose. One night, they hit a roadside store and came out to headlights cutting through fogless dark. No sirens, just engines, coordinated, closing. Clyde cursed once, low, then fired first. The muzzle flashed bright enough to paint Bonnie's face in white fear. Bullets answered from behind a truck. Wood shattered, a window burst. A deputy screamed and fell. The gang sprinted to the ford, boots slipping in loose gravel, bodies colliding like animals in panic. The chase turned into a running firefight. Bonnie leaned out of the rear window, hair whipping, eyes narrowed against wind and smoke. She fired in short, controlled bursts, not wild, not romantic, just survival. The pursuers didn't stop. More cars joined, headlights multiplying like predators. A bullet punched through the trunk, sparking metal. Another tore through the seat, grazing skin. Pain became background noise. They escaped by inches, cutting across a field, crashing through a fence, bursting onto a dirt lane the law hadn't sealed yet. When the Ford finally slowed in deep woods, nobody celebrated. They reloaded in silence, hands shaken only after it was over. Gunfights had become routine, and routine made them colder. But routine also made them fewer. Each clash cost them ammunition, blood, nerves, trust. Another gang member disappeared into the night, either captured, killed, or running alone. Clyde's eyes grew darker, watching every shadow as if betrayal lived inside it. Bonnie could feel the truth tightening like a noose. The more often you survive a shootout, the more certain it becomes that the next one will be your last. The plan for the biggest score wasn't loud. It was surgical. Clyde chose a small regional payroll transfer, the kind that moved cash between towns like a vein carrying blood, guarded by habit more than muscle. A delivery truck would roll at dawn, pass a narrow bridge, then cut behind a feed mill before reaching the bank. 10 minutes of vulnerability. That was all Clyde needed. He drew it on paper, then burned the paper, memorizing every angle like prayer. They arrived before sunrise, hiding the Ford 5.8 under trees. Bonnie stayed still, breath fogging the window, watching shadows shift. Clyde checked weapons with calm hands. 2 pistols, 1 shotgun, spare magazines wrapped in cloth. No extra men. Too many bodies meant too many mistakes. This was going to be clean. Fast money, fast exit, silence. When the truck appeared, its headlights floated through darkness like a slow animal. Clyde stepped out in the road, coat open, gun low but ready. The driver braked hard, confused, then saw Bonnie rise from cover with the shotgun leveled. The world stopped. Clyde yanked the door open, dragged the guard out, slammed him face down. "Don't move! Don't breathe!" Clyde hissed. Bonnie climbed into the truck bed and found the metal cash box, heavy, locked, stamped with bank seals. But the moment the lock clicked under Clyde's crowbar, something felt wrong. Too quiet, no birds, no dogs, no distant engine, the kind of silence that only exists when someone is waiting. Bonnie's eyes flicked to the tree line, then she saw it. A glint, a rifle barrel, just for a second. Her stomach dropped. The trap was already set, and their largest score wasn't money. It was a mistake big enough to end everything. The ambush didn't spring on the bridge. It followed them like a shadow that refused to detach. Clyde escaped the payroll hit by pure instinct, tires chewing dirt, bullets clipping branches as the Ford vanished into woods. But the task force didn't need to catch them in motion anymore. They wanted what criminals fear most, their nest. The tip came from the weakest link, thin and poisonous, an old storm drain outside a rural property, half hidden by weeds and scrap. From the road, it looked like nothing. Up close, it was a mouth. Rangers moved at dusk with lanterns shaded, boots silent, rifles tight against chests. They dropped into the tunnel single file, breath echoing off damp stone, the air thick with rust and rot. Every step felt like entering a throat. 30 yards in, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber, crude but engineered, reinforced with scavenged boards. And there it was, the hidden cache. Stacked ammunition crates, spare Ford parts, tools for breaking locks, plates from 7 states, bundles of road maps marked with circles and arrows, a trunk of cash wrapped in oilcloth, a second trunk, guns, pistols, shotguns, a bar, magazines lined like teeth. On the wall, pinned photos of lawmen, newspaper clippings, a handwritten list of towns, targets. The evidence didn't just confirm crime, it proved structure, strategy, war. They photographed everything, bagged fingerprints, logged serial numbers. One ranger held up a small notebook, Bonnie's blue ink inside, poems beside route times and fuel notes, romance and violence on the same page. The investigators understood the power of this bust. They didn't need the bodies yet. They had the spine of the organization. When they surfaced, cold air hit like relief. The lead investigator's voice was calm as stone. "Now we don't chase ghosts. Now we know where they breathe." It didn't collapse like a building. It collapsed like a body, one organ failing, then another, until motion became impossible. The cash bust changed everything. Overnight, the Barrow gang felt exposed, as if walls no longer existed. Safe houses went cold. Old contacts stopped answering. Mechanics avoided their eyes. Even the road, once endless, began to feel narrow. Clyde tried to tighten control, but control requires trust, and trust was already bleeding out. One man in the crew disappeared after a supply run. No note, no goodbye. Another started drinking too much, hands shaking, staring at shadows like they carried badges. Bonnie watched Clyde's face grow harder, sleep thinner, temper shorter. He began accusing without proof, scanning every movement for betrayal. Paranoia became their third passenger. The law fed that paranoia deliberately. They arrested minor associates and released them just to let fear spread. They let rumors travel, roadblocks everywhere, informants everywhere, rewards doubled. They made the gang feel hunted even when no one fired a shot. It worked. People make mistakes when they feel watched. Then the first real fracture. A captured member, young, scared, didn't flip with a dramatic confession. He flipped with exhaustion. He gave small truths because small truths felt survivable. A diner they favored, a back road cut, a relative who still took their calls. The investigator didn't need poetry. He needed patterns. Clyde still believed speed could fix everything. Bonnie didn't. She could feel the end approaching, not as fate, but as math. Every day they stayed alive required more luck than the day before. Every mile forward narrowed their options. They were still running, still armed, still dangerous, but now the chase had shifted. They weren't outrunning the law anymore. They were just delaying the moment it finally caught up. Louisiana didn't feel like a new state. It felt like the last page. The air was heavier, wet with pine and swamp, and the roads seemed to curve back into themselves as if escape had been removed from the design. Clyde drove slower now, not from caution, but fatigue. The Ford V8 still ran, but it sounded tired, an old beast carrying two ghosts. The setup began quietly, the way serious death always does. A farm road near Bienville Parish, narrow enough to trap speed, bordered by trees thick as walls. The task force chose it because it forced choices: brake, swerve, crash. They positioned men like chess pieces, rifles hidden under coats, bars resting on car hoods, shotguns angled toward the lane, engines off. No cigarettes, no talking. Silence was the camouflage. A decoy vehicle was placed ahead, angled as if broken down, hood up like bait. The informant's details had given them timing, morning hours, a certain route, Clyde's habit of trusting familiar faces. They didn't need to chase. They only needed to wait. In the brush, rangers lay flat, watching insects crawl across their sleeves. Sweat collected under collars, but no one moved. A spotter farther down the road listened for the sound of the Ford long before it appeared. When the distant engine finally whispered through trees, every man tightened his grip. Inside the Ford, Bonnie stared ahead, expression unreadable. She didn't speak of fear anymore. Fear had become constant, like breathing. Clyde's eyes flicked once to the rear mirror, then forward again. He saw the decoy too late to avoid noticing it. Instinct made him ease off the gas. The trap was perfect because it looked like nothing. Just a quiet road, just a stalled car, just one more second stolen from safety. The morning of May 23rd, 1934, was cruelly calm. Sunlight cut through the trees in thin gold blades, warming the dirt road as if it were any other day. Clyde slowed when he saw the decoy car ahead, hood lifted like a broken wing. For a heartbeat, the Ford V8 rolled quietly, tires whispering over dust. Bonnie leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Something felt staged, too still, too clean. Then the world shattered. A rifle barked from the trees, followed instantly by a storm of gunfire. The first bullets punched through the windshield, exploding glass into Bonnie's face like frozen rain. Clyde jerked, hands tightening on the wheel, but there was nowhere to go. Another burst tore through the driver's side door, shredding metal, ripping flesh. The Ford lurched forward, then stalled in pure violence, engine choking as if shot itself. Bonnie reached for a weapon, but the air became a wall of lead. Shotguns boomed at close range. BAR fire chewed the car like a saw through wood. The sound wasn't heroic. It was mechanical slaughter, steady, controlled, endless. Clyde's body snapped against the seat, his head dropping, then lifting again as if refusing death for one more second. Bonnie's mouth opened, but no scream escaped. The noise swallowed everything. The ambush line held formation, men firing in disciplined bursts, aiming low, then high, then low again. They weren't shooting at outlaws anymore. They were erasing a problem. The Ford rocked under impact, glass raining, tires collapsing, doors buckling inward. Blood sprayed across the dashboard, dark and immediate. In less than a minute, it was over. The road returned to silence, except for the ticking of a dying engine and the soft drift of dust settling on shattered metal. Lawmen stepped forward cautiously, rifles still raised. Inside the ruined car, Bonnie and Clyde lay motionless. Two bodies trapped in the wreck of their own myth. No surrender, no last speech, just gunfire and the end. When the firing stopped, the Ford V8 looked less like a car and more like a butchered animal left in the road. Its body was punched full of holes, dozens upon dozens. Metal peeled back like torn skin. The windshield was gone, only jagged edges remaining, glittering in the sun. The driver's door sagged open, warped by impact, its paint chipped away to bare steel. Inside, the air carried a thick mix of cordite, gasoline, and blood, so fresh it still seemed warm. Bonnie lay folded against the seat, hair tangled with glass, her dress darkened in spreading stains. Clyde's hands were still near the wheel, fingers half curled as if he'd tried to hold on to the road itself. The dashboard was soaked. Bullets had shredded the upholstery and carved through the frame, leaving the interior looking like it had been fed to machinery. In the floorboard, a pistol sat unused, trapped under chaos, proof that speed had finally failed. Lawmen approached in careful steps, rifles aimed even though the bodies did not move. One ranger peered in, face tight, and for a moment his eyes showed something close to relief. Then it hardened into professionalism. This wasn't triumph. It was closure. They checked pulses that weren't there. They counted wounds. They marked positions. The investigator spoke quietly. It ends here. Soon, word traveled faster than the dust could settle. People would come. Curious faces, hungry for proof, desperate to witness the death of a myth. The Ford became a relic of violence, a rolling coffin dragged toward town, leaving tracks like scars. And as the sun climbed higher over Louisiana, the road looked ordinary again. Just dirt, trees, and silence. But the car remained, bullet-riddled and unforgiving, as if it carried a final message. Legends don't escape. They just bleed longer before the world catches up. In the evidence room, the myth died a second time, quietly, under fluorescent light. There were no speeding engines here, no gunfire, no romance, just tables, metal tags, clipboard ink. The empire that had terrified half the South was laid out like a corpse being identified. Weapons came first, pistols wrapped in oiled cloth, sawed-off shotguns with splintered stocks, rifles scarred by use, magazines lined like teeth. Boxes of ammunition were counted and recounted until the numbers felt obscene. Stolen license plates were stacked by state, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Louisiana. Each one a mask Clyde had worn on the road. Road maps followed, creased and stained, highways circled in pencil, bridges marked with hard X's, back roads traced like escape veins. Then the personal debris, cash bundles tied with string, jewelry scraped from victims, a set of keys with no rightful door, a lipstick tube, a compact mirror cracked down the middle. Bonnie's notebook sat open under gloved hands, pages filled with clean handwriting, poems beside mileage calculations, beauty beside brutality. In one margin, a line read like prophecy: "We run until the road runs out." Photographs were pinned to boards, crime scenes, dead officers, bullet-riddled walls, the Ford V8 wrecked into history. Each image stripped the story of glamour. Here was the real cost: blood, grief, fear traveling faster than any car. Investigators moved through it with cold focus. They didn't see lovers. They saw an organized pattern of violence stitched together by hunger and ego and speed. Every item became a sentence in a case file. Every item a nail ceiling shut the coffin of legend. In that room, under numbered evidence bags, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were no longer icons. They were proof. The public reckoning didn't happen in one courtroom. It happened everywhere at once. In towns that had been robbed, people stood in groups reading newspapers with tight mouths, eyes scanning names they had cursed for years. In cities, crowds gathered to see the bullet-riddled Ford like it was a traveling circus of death. Some stared in horror. Others stared in fascination. The country couldn't decide whether it had just witnessed justice or a spectacle. Officials stepped forward to dismantle the myth. They spoke in hard facts. Officers killed, civilians terrorized, stolen money that never fed the poor the way legends claimed. They reminded the nation that Bonnie and Clyde didn't steal from banks to punish greed. They stole because crime had become their only language. Every speech carried the same warning: admire the gun long enough, and it will point back at you. Yet the hunger for the story remained. The Depression had taught people to crave rebels, to romanticize anyone who defied systems that had failed them. That is why the myth survived even after the bodies fell. Mothers scolded their children for whispering admiration, while secretly understanding the temptation. Men out of work muttered, "At least they lived free," then lowered their eyes when someone mentioned murdered deputies. The debate turned into a national bruise, and beneath that bruise was a harsher truth. The country had helped create them. not by approving murder, but by starving communities until crime felt like opportunity. Bonnie and Clyde weren't monsters from nowhere. They were the shadow of a broken era shaped by poverty, pride, and the thin line between desperation and violence. When the reckoning ended, no one felt clean. The law had won, but it had also fired into a legend so loudly that history would echo it forever. The myth was condemned and still remembered. In the end, the story wasn't a love story. It was a warning written in bullet holes. Bonnie Parker didn't fall because she was born evil, and Clyde Barrow didn't rise because he was born brave. They fell because hunger convinced them that law was only a wall, and a wall could be broken with speed and steel. For a while, it worked. They stole miles. They stole headlines. They stole the illusion of freedom. But freedom built on violence is never freedom. It is only delay. Every robbery carved another scar into the country. Every shot fired left a family with an empty chair. The myth tried to cover it with romance, lipstick, laughter, photographs, but the truth stayed underneath like blood that won't wash out. Bonnie carried poems in her pocket, yet the road taught her to replace words with weapons. Clyde wanted revenge against a system that broke him, yet revenge only built a larger cage around his soul. The law caught them not because it was perfect, but because violence always creates noise, and noise creates patterns. No matter how fast you run, the world learns your footsteps. In Louisiana, on a quiet road, the chase ended the only way it could. Not with surrender, not with redemption, but with a storm of gunfire that erased 2 lives and sealed a chapter of national shame. And still, one question remains, quiet, stubborn, hanging in the air long after the Ford stopped ticking. If you had been born into their dust, their hunger, their hopeless days, would you have chosen differently? Most people want to answer yes, but the story of Bonnie and Clyde exists to remind us that the line between ordinary and outlaw is thinner than we'd like to believe. Because crime does not begin with a gun. It begins when a human being stops believing they belong in the world.